Cooking Law is what you're listening to right now. This is Radio 97 with Despina Priala from Priala Legal. If you have a question about, well, I guess about terminating your contract, about bylaws, about whatever it is, Despina happy to answer it for you. And to get the question to us, just go to the website radio97.com.au and you'll find a couple of ways to contact us there, radio97.com.au.
Thank you, Wayno. And like we mentioned just before the break, Despina, we have been talking a fair bit about bylaws when buying a property. But what we've recently found out just this morning, thanks to you off air, you said, you know, some of them can actually be invalid. I didn't know that. And I'd love to know, how this came to be and why you want to talk about this morning.
Well, I want to talk about bylaws once again because last week was a very popular segment I've seen over the course of the last few days online. And obviously it sort of hit a little bit of a chord with a lot of people where, you know, you had this issue of an architectural code affecting how you use your lot and your house in that situation we talked about last week. And bylaws are always a very interesting and, you know, potentially controversial. Yes. And
weird and wonderful world of bylaws.
Yes. And the whole point is, look, if you want to live in strata, you've got to know what the bylaws say and you're going to have to accept them. Now, in saying that, right, what if the bylaws are invalid? So I did say last week, and I've said before, you go into strata, you got bylaws, which are rules, right? And you've got to comply with them. Now, when I say you've got to comply with them, okay, are they valid or are they invalid? So that's the tricky bit. And when you said before, can they be invalid? Absolutely. I mean, you've got potentially a lot of strata schemes. So they're really called strata schemes in New South Wales and in Queensland, community title schemes. Same thing in essence. But you've got a lot of them out there that potentially have invalid bylaws, even what they call their standard bylaws. So not a bylaw that was very colourfully drafted to have something, you know, outside the box. We're talking about just standard bylaws that could actually be invalid.
Interesting.
So what kind of bylaws are we talking? Because I know last week you were giving a few examples and they all sound pretty straightforward. So does it stand out when you read them? Would you know straight away if they're invalid?
So probably not the lay person would pick up on the fact of a particular bylaw that might be invalid under the relevant legislation, New South Wales or Queensland or other states. So they might not pick up on it straight away. But I guess what I'd like to do this morning is just use some of the language that has been seen in invalid bylaws. So if you're reading it in your bylaws, you might think, ooh, is this valid or invalid? And why do you care? It might affect how you use your lot or common property. So there was a recent decision that came out in New South Wales, because last week we talked about Queensland. So I like to share, you know, sharing is caring. So we want to talk about Queensland and New South Wales where we can. So the tribunal issued a recent decision and they declared a bylaw invalid, and the bylaw was a prohibitory bylaw. So where you have a bylaw that prohibits a particular act or conduct, you want to be super careful because generally those bylaws are invalid. So where you have a bylaw that says this act or conduct or matter or item is prohibited, well, you really can't do that normally. And that will be considered invalid. Because bylaws can't be considered harsh or unconscionable or oppressive. They've got to be reasonable. So a blanket prohibition, right, is generally considered to be invalid, but it does depend on what it is. But you don't want to use that language. So in the recent changes to New South Wales with pets and the bylaws for pets and having pets in your community title scheme or strata scheme, there was once a time where they had a prohibition. You can't have pets. Well, you can't do that anymore. And we've seen that in the progression of the laws in Queensland and New South Wales. You just can't have a prohibition on pets. But that was a bylaw previously that had a prohibition on pets, you see. So that's why I'm using that word prohibition. If you see it in a bylaw, you might want to test it and see if it is valid or invalid. But there was a case that came out recently and it had a bylaw prohibiting, if you believe this, cooking. That's right. There was a blanket ban on cooking inside a lot.
A place that someone would live. No.
Yes, 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 exactly. So you think, how can that be?
How?
No,
So-
take away every night. Yippee.
Uber Eats, here I come.
Exactly. Will the body corporate pay for that? So
How
exactly.
is that possible?
Well, this was unusual, I think, in that it was 87 residential lots and it was in a former aged care centre. So the units are relatively small. They were like between 21 and 30 square metres, are very small lots. And there was only a kitchenette installed. And they already had a big commercial grade community kitchen. But that didn't justify a blanket ban on cooking. And the tribunal actually said, look, any alleged fire risk could easily be adequately managed within a lot, even though they're very small. And any cooking smell, right, that might be part of a lot could easily be overcome by opening a window. So the basis of that was that you can't just have these blanket bans or prohibitions. It's all about, bylaws are there to basically manage lot owners and occupiers' behaviours predominantly in common property. So you've got to have bylaws that provide these rules about, well, what can you do and what you can't do on common property. So ultimately, so you don't interfere with someone else's use and enjoyment of their own lot and common property. That's the basic premise, right? So blanket prohibitions and bans are just a no-no. Okay. And if you've got wording, the other wording that you might see in your bylaw, which is what I wanted to mention, likely to interfere with someone's use and enjoyment, well, that's invalid. Right? Because pretty much because you can't really, well, what does that even mean? Likely to interfere. What you're trying to do is you're trying to say not unreasonably interfere. So this word reasonable and unreasonable is always pretty much used. Likely to interfere means what? So if you have a
bit vague.
Well, it's a little bit ambiguous. So, and that's not what the legislation is really promoting or underlying. It talks about reasonable interference or unreasonable interference with one's use and enjoyment of a lot and common property, right? So that's what we're really talking about. So if you see wording like that, so if you see bans, prohibitions, likely to interfere, that sort of wording might actually cause your bylaw to be invalid.
Alarm bells.
Yeah, check your bylaws.
Legal alarm bells going off. All right. Well, thank you so much, Despina, for coming on the show this morning. And if anyone wants to get in touch with you directly with a question or a query, where can they go?
So they can phone the office 55291 294. I don't get many calls, so maybe people are a bit shy, but that's all right. So you can always email. So, if you want a question answered, no problem. So info@prialalegal.com.au. Amazing.
Thank you so much, Despina and Wayne. Oh, okay.
Very good.
Thanks. Wayne, no thanks to Wayne. Catch you next time. Can you catch you next time?
We'll see you next week.
See you then.